Thanks so much, and it's a pleasure for me to be here at the Hayek Institute and the Austrian Economics Center. I'm currently actually working at two places. One is a Foresight Center, which is a relatively new think tank in Estonia, and I will talk a little bit more about what we do when I get to the end of our talk. I'm going to talk about sort of different scenarios about digital governance. And in addition to that, I'm also at the Estonian Business School. Actually, I just, on the way here, I updated slightly those slides, but just 1 hour ago, when I had already updated the slides, that I heard the news that our university senate actually elected me a full professor in political economy. So the title there is will be soon a little bit, old. But Estonian Business School is a private university in Estonia. We're actually the oldest private university, which means that we are 30 years old. And we have two campuses. One is in Tallinn, Estonia, and one is in Helsinki, Finland. And we have about 1,400 students. And broadly, we are not sort of business school in a narrow sense, that we don't only sort of teach MBAs and so on, but we offer undergraduate degrees, different master's degrees, and also PhDs. So we are sort of management university, or broader social sciences management university. And we're also the most international university in Estonia. About 30% of our students are from different other countries than Estonia. And I think we have students from at least something like 60 different countries. And a really nice campus in the central Tallinn, and another one also in Helsinki, in the district where lots of startup companies are in Helsinki. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to structure this talk in terms of number of trade-offs. And I start by giving a little bit sort of political economic context before I go to the digital governance. So those are the trade-offs about digital governance, but this is more about sort of political economic context, because I think it's very difficult to talk about governance without looking also what happens outside, in the how economic institutions, political institutions change over time. And I think there is also a connection between different types of reforms that also Barbara mentioned. Mark Lahr and digital governance in Estonia. I will come to that. And in the end, I will also talk a little bit about future and the way we think about the future of digital governance in Estonia. So, what I mean by that is that in early 1990s, different countries in Central Eastern Europe chose different paths how to go ahead, how to carry out the transformation. And some countries went for a sort of very radical, comprehensive reforms, trying to change everything quite rapidly and quickly. And there were some other countries who went by sort of trying to change one thing and sort of very gradual approach. And Estonia was one of the countries that actually changed quite rapidly, and even Barack Obama, when he was in Estonia in 2014, in his speech, kind of recognized that, saying that that we have taken on tough reforms, have been quite successful in carrying out free market reforms, and he also talked about lots of things that I'm actually going to touch on, such as e-government, sort of entrepreneurial discovery processes, and so on. Companies like Skype and so on. So if you just look at the sum of the data, what I mean by that as a sort of introduction is that sort of in the mid-1990s, if you look at the different sort of indicators like GDP per capita or labor productivity, we were slightly below 40% of what can be considered sort of EU average. And we have sort of grown to be around 70% of the EU average. In the city where I live, it's probably, Tallinn, it's probably like 120%, but we have sort of somewhat uneven development in different regions, so it depends, but overall the average is this one. Maybe even more easy way to understand what I'm sort of trying to say is, if you look at the per capita GDP, you see that we used to be a very, very poor country in the 1990s, and Greece was considerably richer. Slovenia was considerably richer than Estonia, but now you can see that, well, we have kind of become quite equal, sort of catching up. And of course, if you sort of make a comparison with Slovenia, then Slovenia has been sort of like a very gradual reformer. Estonia has been very kind of like a radical reformer, sort of trying to undertake lots of reforms at the same time. What are some of those reforms? Some of you already know, maybe many of them. Barbara certainly knows, but just to refresh your memory or to highlight some of the key reforms. And what I have here is that it's not just like me coming from Estonia and telling you that that's what we did, but this is sort of actually based on lots of different academic sources, scholars from US Berkeley or Razin Sally, I assume that he's been here as well. He's now at University of Singapore, but used to be at London School of Economics, together with Magnus Feldman, who did his PhD at Harvard. So anyway, there is like a considerable scholarship on Estonian reforms, published in good peer-reviewed academic journals. So that's what I'm sort of trying to say. And some of the key things have been obviously rule of law, sort of quite stable property rights, and quite serious license constraint from the early 1990s onward. The currency board, I assume everybody is more or less familiar what the currency board is. So we had a currency board actually implemented against the advice of International Monetary Fund in 1992.
What did the monetary fund, what was the proposition of?
They wanted us to stay in the ruble zone and have in the ruble zone, in the zone of. They didn't want us to introduce new currency, Estonian kron. They wanted us to keep to this the ruble and stay, in 1992, yeah. And later on, of course, as it was successful, they started actually to advise other countries like Bulgaria, Lithuania to do the same thing, and also Bulgaria and Lithuania and a bunch of other countries also adopted currency board. And of course, we had currency board until we joined the euro, when lots of countries were actually thinking about leaving in 2011. Anyway, so that was one of the reforms. And in trade policy, so we basically started to pursue from the mid-1990s unilateral free trade, including agriculture, which is very unique in the global economic history. You have Great Britain in the second half of the 19th century doing something similar. Maybe Hong Kong and so on, but very few countries. Razin has written about that extensively. He was kind of a big fan of that, and so are lots of sort of other trade economists. Of course, until we joined the EU in 2004, right? So, and in fiscal policy, we have tried to keep the budget balanced. We have the lowest levels of government debt in Estonia. We have a relatively simple tax system, even though that the current government is kind of trying to make it more complicated. And most importantly, we have had like a proportional income tax, no tax on corporate profits as long as they're reinvested and so on. And we carried out sort of very rapid and large-scale privatization, in the 1990s. And I think that sort of digitalization is kind of connected to all of that, in the sense that by making government services digital, it has allowed to cut transaction costs. It has allowed to make services more transparent. Of course, the impact is kind of difficult to measure, because digitalization is not such an easy thing to take and measure. Already like a long time ago, I think it was Robert Solow who said that I can see computers everywhere, right, except in productivity statistics. There are attempts to measure what the impacts have been, but I think it's also connected to that. And obviously, one of the guys who has been fundamental to those reforms has been Mart Laar, that Barbara mentioned. And Mart Laar has been also sort of like a champion of digitalization in Estonia when he has been a prime minister, especially in his second term. Right. Just some other data before I go to the digital governance. That's the ranking from the Heritage. There's another one from Fraser. specific position may vary, but the bottom line is that Estonia has been, in general, ranked quite highly by both indexes about economic freedom. That's the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, also ranked quite highly. And you have Corruption Perception Index. Well, if you look at this index, we probably have been historically the least corrupt. Whatever, again, like the specific methods and shortcomings of those methods are, but by this index we have been one of the least, or the least corrupt country in the Central Eastern Europe. Also, what is quite interesting is that that's the OECD data. We have lots of trust in Estonia in each other, so which also makes it easier to conduct business. It might be that we're a relatively small country, and yeah, we have sort of similar levels of trust than people in Switzerland have, which again can cut transaction costs and is important. And another sort of data point here is about the government debt, right? So we are somewhere here, around 10% of GDP, and that has been kind of underlying philosophy in Estonia. We often have a coalition governments, and there are sort of somewhat different views now and then. Some political parties perhaps would like to borrow more, but in general, because you have to have a coalitions, it's difficult to get agreement to sort of engage in sort of a very relaxed fiscal policy and borrow more. And of course, once Financial Times had an editorial a couple of years ago where they basically, the title of the editorial was that Estonia is the anti-Greece. Okay, so not anti-Christ, but anti-Greece. So in a way, we have done lots of things very differently if you make these comparisons. All right, so that's my introduction, sort of trying to build a context, sort of political and economic context. And now I'm going to the digital governance, right? And first, what I want to emphasize is that often people, when they look at the outcomes in Estonia, then they think that there has been very rapid, very radical, kind of very revolutionary changes. A couple of months ago, I was actually speaking in Strasbourg, and I was asked to talk to a bunch of scholars who study public administration, and they had titled my talk something like "New Challenges to the Public Administration, Digital Revolution." Right? And one of the things I said that actually the changes have been taking place for a quite long time. If you look now, one of the most radical things that Estonia has done, I'm just giving you now like a few examples. One of the things we have done is that you can actually vote online in Estonia. Okay, we have internet voting. This is very rare. Very few countries do that. Okay, for a number of reasons, right? But we do. And 1/3 of votes are submitted online. Okay, it seems very radical, but they have been doing it for 12 years or 13 years. Okay, so it's in that sense that really the technology has been out there. So somewhere here, lots of decisions were made that actually we can do it, right? Technology has been out there, but initially it was only 2% of the people who submitted their votes online, and that has sort of increased gradually to that 1/3. And that's if you know the theories of Rogers about diffusion of technology. So this is sort of typical story of diffusion of knowledge, diffusion of innovations. That you have early adopters and then people who come later. And since I'm at Hayek Institute, I think Hayek even wrote about that before Rogers in the Constitution of Liberty, where he talked about sort of maybe wealthier or better people like making decisions early, and then they're like sort of pioneers showing others the way, right? So it's also quite consistent what Hayek has written. So that's my sort of first point. But I think it's more like evolutionary rather than revolutionary process, even in the case of internet voting. Then another sort of trade-off in digital governance that I want to talk about is this sort of institutions versus technology. Because often when I speak to the people, then lots of people are very sort of, to put it nicely, let's say technology optimists, right? To put it maybe not so nicely, sort of technology determinists, right? So, and people say things that, even like members of Estonian parliament that I have sort of spoken to recently, some of them say things like that, well, in the future, because of technology, we don't need a parliament anymore, maybe you can just go and vote online, or we don't need statistics office anymore because there will be big data and and artificial intelligence can take care of everything, and no need to employ anybody at statistics office. And I'm not saying that it might not be true. I don't know what the future will bring. So it's plausible, right? I agree, and maybe there are technological capabilities out there that allow us to do that. But the point is that in order to get there, you have to make changes in institutions. And what I mean by changes in institutions here is basically rules of the game, right? Like Douglas North has defined them, or sort of new institutional economists, political scientists do that. Those are both formal rules, laws and regulations, but those are also informal rules. Our sort of social norms, attitudes, and so on. So there must be change there. So technology, as such, is not sufficient for any kind of change to happen. And now I'm sort of showing you some of the technologies that I consider absolutely fundamental for the success of Estonian digital government. Okay, and some of those technologies are really simple. Okay, but in order to even use the simple technologies in different settings, you actually need to make lots of decisions. You need to change the rules. Let's start by this one. So this technology dates back to 1996. So when there were startup banks in Estonia, Hansapank was the first one, and they introduced internet banking. Okay, I remember it very vividly that I went to the bank in Old Town of Tallinn, and I was asked that, why do you come here? Why don't you go home and do your banking at home, right? And they introduced this card, very simplistic. This is sort of the same thing, a newer version of that. And this is already like more updated one, the BIM calculator. Okay? And now the connection between this sort of private identification, right, in order to use internet banking to the government is that in 2000, Estonian tax authorities said that, okay, let's make it possible for people to declare taxes online, okay? But the question is that how do we identify them, okay? And it wasn't that easy because I was actually involved in the startup scene in the late 1990s in Estonia, and we had one huge problem. The problem was that it was very difficult for us to collect payments from the people, especially outside of Estonia, because using credit cards was kind of expensive. Plus Estonians didn't have credit cards, so internet banking actually helped there, and tax authority decided that, all right, let people log into the tax authority system through their banks. Okay, so in a way, internet banks, to start the banks, were a platform, digital platform for providing government service, and you can see that even now. From this is the website of the Estonian Tax Authority. There are all those banks here. You can log into the system. Even now, you can basically use those old cards, and still lots of people do that to do banking, even though that they're sort of trying gradually to phase them out. Because since early 2000s, we have had this thing, which is Estonian digital identity card. So again, like Barbara mentioned, Mark Laar. Mark Laar was second time Prime Minister in the late 1990s, early 2000s. First he was in the early 1990s, and it was one of the last decisions before he left office, right, to approve this thing. Initially, it was not very popular in the sense that it's compulsory to have it, but it's not compulsory to use it online. Okay, so I can use it, for instance, when I travel to Austria. I don't need to take my passport. I can use it. It's a digital ID, but you can also, with this chip, you can sort of put it into your computer, card reader, and do lots of transactions online, banking, government, whatever. But it took time for that to become popular, right? So initially there was a joke, basically, people saying that, well, it's good for getting rid of the ice on your car window or something like that. So it was not very useful, perhaps, considered in the beginning. And now, of course, with this card, you can also go into business with the government and banks and so on. And on the basis of this card, about 10 years ago, we introduced something like a mobile ID. For instance, I don't use anymore this card, I use mobile ID. So the point is that there are sort of diversity of identification methods that you can use in interacting both with government and also with the private sector service providers. And there is quite a lot of sort of collaboration between private sector and the government. You know, as I already mentioned, the government has used internet banking as a platform to provide their own services, and also this is government issued ID, but lots of private sector companies also use it. And on the basis of that, this sort of, which is really fundamental for the digital ecosystem in Estonia to one function, we have launched something like this. Okay, I don't know if you know Edward Lucas. He's not Estonian, he does not live in Estonia, he lives in London. He's a journalist for The Economist, right? And he's one of the guys who became what is called Estonian e-resident, right? So you don't have to be physically in Estonia to take advantage of this ecosystem, because now the country is issuing those e-residency cards, and there are over 20,000 people who have actually become Estonian e-residents, right? And that's because this card or identification system is kind of a platform, right? And you know, basically we want to take it. You know, we have already taken it to the global, but even more to do so. So that's the plan. Of course, for libertarians, and not only for libertarians, but for people in different countries, it might be a little bit. The whole system might be a little bit sort of cause for concern. Let me just explain a little bit. I lived about 10 years outside of Estonia, in UK, in London and in Boston. And in the United States, for instance, you're given the social security card. And one thing you will do is that you will keep your social security number secret. You don't want to share it, right? If you share it, lots of bad things will happen there, right? But in the case of Estonia, the number is public, right? And it's not only public, but on the basis of this number, I can actually say lots of things about Edward Lucas. I can tell first that he's a male. That's what the first number indicates. Second, I can also tell that he was born in '62. And I can also tell that that's sort of the month and the day he was born, right? So I can say lots of things. And understandably, in many countries where people appreciate their privacy and security more, you know, they would be uncomfortable with that, right? So that's sort of the thing that the government is thinking about, is that, you know, if you want that to be a global success, maybe we should at least sort of change the number, that you wouldn't discriminate on the basis of number, say that this is female, male, this is so old guy, and so on. So that's sort of the concern. And it's a little bit, I guess, in the case of Estonia, if you talk about legacies, it's a little bit sort of like a Soviet legacy, that they're sort of comfortable with having this sort of identity number public. But at the same time, you cannot really do anything with this number, because in order to do any kind of transactions and so on, you need two sort of secret codes, PIN codes. One is 4 digits and another one is 5 digits, and this is what we keep secret. So it has a little bit like a different status than American Social Security number, right? Anyway, the point here was that some of those technologies are really simplistic, but in order then for it to diffuse and to be used, you actually need to make lots of sort of institutional decisions, or formal rules must be changed. But it's also very dependent on what kind of attitudes or social norms and what is kind of acceptable in different contexts. So that was sort of what I tried to illustrate with this trade-off. Okay, efficiency versus equity. Very briefly, again using this example of internet voting, very efficient. This is the voting time in seconds, right? It's a very efficient process. The same guys have calculated that it actually takes about 30 minutes to vote offline. So that's one of my co-authors, Mikkel Solbak from Tartu University. And here, actually, a very interesting thing is that it takes for younger people to vote longer than for the older people. So again, like my point, it's not about technology. It's not about technology use. It's just that older people have already kind of really predetermined views for whom they want to vote, while young people need to take some time to make up their mind for whom to vote. But so this internet voting has worked well, but it's not really, internet voting is not really about kind of encouraging participation and so on. I see it more like a service, because it hasn't actually led to the increased turnout. What is not working so well is getting people involved in the democratic processes. As you can see, it's not working at all, right? I actually studied this issue already here, and then I was sort of saying that, well, it's not kind of working, and since then it has kind of actually worse. Okay? So the point here was that we are very efficient, we're very good in providing digital services, but we're not very good in using digital tools, getting people involved in the democratic processes, kind of going and expressing their opinions and so on. So it's sort of like a services first, democracy later type of approach. Okay, okay, inclusion versus exclusion. You can talk about it a number of ways. First slide is about countries. And I think what is really important, I've already mentioned internet banking many times, and that's why my talk is called From Internet Banking to Internet Voting, that because I saw this sort of internet banking as sort of fundamental for the Estonian government services to take off. And one thing that I wanted to point out is that internet banking is actually very kind of like a more sophisticated service than just going and Googling or looking at some websites. And in Estonia, I'm sorry, the line is not very visible, but this is the line, right? In Estonia, about 80% of individuals aged 16 to 74 do internet banking, okay? 80%, it's not 80% of internet users, but all grown-ups basically, right? So while in some other countries, like in Bulgaria and Romania, it's a 4-5%. So it's not a very inclusive service, right? But I think for digital government, it's fundamental that that kind of services are used, because you don't interact with the government very often. You don't interact with the government very often, and if you only like vote in a few years, or you pay your taxes and so on, and if you don't have this habit of using the internet for different things, then it's also difficult to get you to use government services, right? So, and the EU average is also not very high. So it's somewhere here, right? So, and I made this comparison with, the sort of the countries that are comparable to Estonia, such as sort of former Soviet, Soviet Union members and sort of Central Eastern European sort of former socialist countries, right? And now we can, another example, we can go from this sort of country comparison to the within country. And within countries, there are also different socioeconomic groups. One way to sort of think about that is that different socioeconomic groups support different parties. And in the case of Estonia, the most popular political parties are a Reform Party, which is sort of classical liberal, more or less, and Center Party, which is kind of like centrist, populist, and so on. And usually those parties in the elections get about 25 to 30% of the votes. But if you look at the internet votes, 32.6%, very, very diverse. And it means that sort of different socioeconomic groups support those parties, older people, more Russian-speaking people perhaps who are living closer to the Russian border, and so on, and who don't use internet perhaps so much. And of course that has created the perception among the Center Party, where the current Prime Minister comes from, that internet voting is not good for them, okay? And internet voting is actually, if usually there's a kind of broad consensus in Estonia that digitalization is an important thing, and there's a huge sort of support for digitalization of services and so on, then internet voting is kind of the most contested issue, okay? Primarily because Center Party does not support it, because they think they're losing out, which analytically is not correct, because internet voting has not increased turnout, right? Maybe only a little bit. And if it doesn't not increase turnout, then it's just like the supporters of Reform Party are more comfortable using internet than to go vote online. So, but still, Center Party has this perception that it hurts them, and that's why there is a little bit more debate on this issue than in maybe on some other digitalization issues. Okay, platformization versus pluralism. What I mean by that is that increasingly, if you look at digitalization, not just in Estonia, but everywhere in the world, you see the rise of platforms. Facebook, Google, there is a literature on government as a platform, on e-governance, right? And there is this sort of danger that if those platforms set very tough standards and so on, they become kind of like a gated communities, right? And that can be, you know, hurting sort of diversity and pluralism out there, right? Sort of the early kind of views of internet, one's kind of like favor of that. In Estonia, we have a platform which is called X-Road, and this is a fundamental backbone for the digital governance. And it's quite interesting also how ideas can have a huge impact on policy, because it was the idea comes from the master's thesis of a student at Tartu University in early 2000s, and then he went to work for a company called Cybernetica. It's a private company, and they are behind it. And basically this idea became the whole kind of backbone of the ecosystem. And it's not just for the government, it's also for the private sector. And what it allows you to do is basically allows different databases to talk to each other, right? So it's not a big database. It's actually relatively decentralized. It's not very centralized, but allows different databases to talk to each other. And it always timestamps whatever data has been acquired, who acquired when. You can go back and sort of check that why was this data acquired or not, okay? Nowadays there's a lot of talk about blockchain. Sometimes Estonia is also labeled a blockchain country, but it's not a blockchain that we now call blockchain. You can kind of say that we have had something similar to blockchain in place for a long time, perhaps a little bit more centralized than blockchain, and somewhat sort of different before we even knew this thing is called blockchain, right? And yeah, so that's sort of really essential. And another thing that it allows you to do is that it allows you to collect lots of data. Okay, if you digitalize your government service and have more and more data, I could show some other stuff that we have here. But this is just about the use of any service from disconnected to the X-Road, and this is the use by people, right? And as you can see, it kind of goes up. But you can do things like you can look at what one of the most used services, digital prescriptions, right? You can go and actually see what kind of prescriptions have been written out to the people, and how many of them, or what's the percentage that they actually have used or purchased, and so on. Lots of other things can be done on the basis of data collected here. Sometimes, when I read about Estonian digital government, both in some of the academic works and also in the popular magazines, you get the feeling that it has been sort of very strategic decision making that has been behind it. The government has set the goal, and then everything has moved in this direction. I think there have been some important decisions made, but overall, I think there has been a little bit more like a bottom-up approach. Okay. The politicians have not interfered very much. I gave you this example of tax authority. When they decided to go ahead with that and collaborate with the banks, there was no prime minister or politician telling them not to do so, right? And that's why actually some of the services you see, they're kind of uneven. We are very good in tax authority is good, road administration is good, but if you look at sort of healthcare or social areas, it's not as developed, right? So, and we also have our own white elephants now, where lots of money has been invested, but not so much success is resulting from that. So that's sort of the network analysis of the ecosystem. And what I just want to show with this slide is that sort of the tax authority is really in the center here. So there is no some kind of central government portal. We have a central government portal which is called ASD.ee, but it's not as heavily used as sort of specific services, right? So it's not as sort of centralized or strategic, some of the stuff maybe that has happened has been more like accidental rather than sort of great planner has sort of said that this should be done, right? And I think in many ways in Estonia, the sort of entrepreneurial discovery has been important, because I already sort of talked about how internet banks were really like early pioneers, because there were startup companies. There was no sort of banking in a sense as you had banking in Western Europe, in Soviet Union, right? So they started from nothing. It made life easier. And also I think having lots of sort of successful entrepreneurs in Estonia also puts pressure on government to innovate. And here are some of the examples. Anybody, have you met those guys? So those are the guys who founded Skype, right? And a little bit sad on this picture. First they sold Skype to eBay for 2.6 billion. Then they repurchased it back and sold to the Microsoft for 8.5 billion. So this is one of the Estonian unicorns, valued more than unicorn. Definition of unicorn value is higher than 1 billion, right? So later on, people get a bit happier. So those two guys are actually the richest guys in Estonia. David was a first employee of Skype, and he went on to found with his friend Christos a company called TransferWise. They have a headquarters in London, but 70% of their workforce is in Tallinn, Estonia. They market themselves as a London fintech company. Richard Branson is one of their investors, right? And they also valued now at more than 1 billion. And here they are basically in front of Bank of England. It's the marketing campaign. They're competing very aggressively in foreign exchange market. I'm a big fan, I'm a big customer. I actually had a student who just wrote a master's thesis on TransferWise in UK. She works for the company and was also able to interview David for the thesis. Again, like another sort of example how this sort of Skype alumni has gone and founded new companies. And the newest unicorn is actually a company called Taxify, which is a ride-sharing app, competes with Uber, at least something in 30-40 markets. And they are a unicorn now, just as of 1 week ago, because Daimler decided the future is in ride-sharing, not in producing cars, and put lots of money into Taxify, which made the company. We also have other investors, like Chinese platform Didi is an investor there as well. And I'm especially proud because coming from the Estonian Business School, those are two brothers. Older brother is actually our graduate. The younger brother, well, he only managed to take 1 semester at the university because they founded the company when he was 19. So, and he's now like 24 or 23. So we have at least sort of 3 unicorns and lots of sort of other interesting companies. For instance, yesterday I just heard that again, like one of the companies founded by the students of EBS called Verif raised about 8 million. Among the investors are, for instance, Aston Kutcher. So it's sort of digital identity company. So there are lots of sort of great success stories. So this is Krista Kruustik, who's one of the most successful female entrepreneurs. Here she's getting a check from the president personally for some kind of entrepreneurship award and so on. So the point is that there is this entrepreneurial spirit, right? Lots of entrepreneurs there, and that also kind of forces people in the public sector perhaps to think a bit more entrepreneurially. In general, often when you talk about innovation, we look at R&D spending and so on. If you look at this data, there is nothing beautiful. It's like American mountains, so it doesn't actually reflect what I was just telling you before. Same thing in the EU. We have this European Innovation Scoreboard. They're kind of in the middle, sort of less innovative than Austria or Germany or others. So it might be again that maybe some of the innovation that kind of happens in Estonia, it's not so easy to capture. I have this sort of example about Skype. It's written in 2004, just a few months before the Skype was purchased by eBay. And if you read the story, like, did eBay really pay 2.6 billion for this company, right? I mean, that's because it almost seems that, well, he just went some random people at some kind of bohemian bohemian bar in Berlin who talked about like beating big established companies. But it may have to do a little bit what Steve Jobs once said, that maybe it's not so much about the resources you have, but also a little bit your mental models, whether you kind of go back to these institutions, social norms, attitudes, and so on. And this is something that is, I guess, much more difficult to change than just giving money to the people, right? So, as Einstein also has said, the mental model is much more difficult to break or change. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a little bit whether those interesting things we have done in Estonia, whether they could be transferred to the other countries. Okay, so there is a lot of this literature and best practices that we can learn from other countries and transfer those things. I usually then just think that it's very difficult to transfer because the contexts are often very different. You know, even in the United States, there is some literature on trying to clone Silicon Valley, right? There is some great stuff is written how, for instance, Albany in New York decided that, well, let's do a Silicon Valley around Albany. And you're thinking, well, it's the United States. They have the same constitution, same rules and regulations. But there is something very specific about Silicon Valley, about this ecosystem. You cannot just go and take it and put it in a different place, right? So, but we do have some examples where we have tried to transfer some of the things we do in Estonia. Of course, in a different context, they work differently. We'll see what will come out of it. First, about this digital identity. In Japan, they introduced something called My Number, which is trying to implement what is something similar than Estonia. Japanese companies and Japanese government is very interested in what's going on in Estonia. And lots of Estonian startups, we have big Japanese companies as investors, and they've been kind of close attention. Last year we had a scholar for an entire year, we had a scholar at the Estonian Business School at the Ritsumeikan University, which is the largest private university in Japan. And he got a grant from government just to come and study for a year Estonian startups, right, and sort of financing. So there is a lot of interest there. We'll see how it works out, relatively new thing. Well, here is Namibia, right? Namibia has purchased X-Road, right? So has Azerbaijan purchased X-Road, this sort of government platform. Finland has purchased X-Road. So this is the example of Finland. So we'll see how it works out. And there have been also attempts to sell it to the other countries like UK and so on, which have not been so successful yet. But anyway, there is this approach that, you know, these systems that we have developed, platforms that we can also export them. And then one example I have here as well is a company called Smartmatic. It's an Amsterdam-based voting technology company. By voting technology here, I mean the sort of old-fashioned voting technology that you go to the voting booth and you have some kind of machine there and you push buttons, right? But they have also sort of invested in studying together with Cybernetica internet voting, since, you know, if any country in the future would want to do something like this, then you know, they have kind of prepared for that. They have a research and development center in Estonia where they kind of focus on this issue. So those are some of the examples or some of the practices that can be transferred. And overall, on this EU Digital Economy and Society Index, if you look at Estonia, we are not number one because they're very good in digital public services, among the best, I guess. This is the orange here. But for instance, we're not very good in digitalization of manufacturing. Right? We have quite a lot of services and so on, and maybe on some other issues not so bad, like human capital and connectivity, but this is really our shortcoming. So I guess we talk about best practices. Yes, we can maybe offer some lessons or you know, there maybe some ideas that you can learn from Estonia, but in other areas such as what is called Industry 4.0 or we probably need to learn from other countries, because here we are like really behind. So it's learning, I guess, in this way goes both ways. Yeah. Now, so far I talked about kind of history and present. Well, maybe some of the things I talked about is future, but it's maybe future in some other, indicates that countries might learn from Estonia and might be the future. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about future in Estonia. And one way to deal with the future is to do some kind of forecast. Okay, so basically to say that, well, we have lots of data, and this sort of trend line will continue in the future. But we have some problems with forecasting, and that's why we went for what is called scenario planning. Is it familiar? Have you heard of scenario planning? Yeah, some of you. The problem with the forecasting is you may have heard the story about Turkey. Anybody knows the story about Turkey? Seen it before? No? Okay. This is sort of the story of the turkey, right? It's the well-being of the turkey. It's here. Then you have a number of days of the turkey, and this is the trend line, right? And now, if I would do forecast, I would basically say that, well, this past data probably indicates that this trend continues in the future, right? But in this case, the turkey is underestimating something, and what is underestimated is the Thanksgiving, right? So that well-being goes down. So you may have radical changes that, from the point of view of Turkey, you don't expect. So if you think about the future of digitalization or any other future, then perhaps forecasting can be a little bit limited, because you end up somewhere here, right? So of course, like in forecasting, forecasting, of course, they don't usually always show like one trend line. You can have this sort of baseline scenario. You can have more pessimistic alternative and more optimistic alternative. But from the scenario planning point of view, it's also not sufficient. So I borrowed this slide from the people who the concept comes from the people who research and teach scenario planning at Oxford Business School. They're dealing with this tuna environments, right? Which is very turbulent. You have lots of uncertainty, as we already know from Hayek. Uncertainty is fundamentally different than risk, right? Lots of unknowns. You cannot kind of predict, or from Frank Knight and others, we know that there is a fundamental difference. Things are new, ambiguous, and so on. So that's why probably thinking in terms of alternative scenarios is a little bit more like an art form. But you could also say that, well, forecasting in a way is an art form, because you have to make assumption that whatever has been in the past will continue in the future, right? Is probably more relevant here. And of course, prediction is the most simplest thing. You just sort of state what you think that things will be. And it's quite widely used, scenario planning. One of the examples I have here is European Union. Anybody read this white paper? Scenarios about the future of the EU that they published about a year ago. In corporate world, the heavy user of scenario planning is, for instance, Royal Dutch Shell. A very typical story that people tell about the scenario planning is that Shell had a scenario about the collapse of the Soviet Union already in the late 70s, early 80s. At that time, so-called Sovietologists in the West, who studied very carefully the Soviet Union, didn't think, this is the likely scenario, right? Yeah, and of course, it seemed a bit like crazy, but the point here is that you also have to think about sort of very crazy alternatives that are not maybe, probable, right? But they are, perhaps possible in the future. And of course, in that sense, this is a very modest exercise, right? Because some of the crazy scenarios are not here on the picture. But of course, since it comes out of the EU Commission, they cannot probably do that because, yeah. And I think in the case of ICTs, it's also important to think more in in terms of scenarios, because people think about the government and ICTs very differently, right? Different countries do, different scholars do. And this is from Patrick Van Leeuwen, who's a professor at London School of Economics. And he has come up with this framework where he has like 6 different ways of thinking about ICTs. I didn't like it very much, or I didn't like it completely. I like it to some extent. I changed it a little bit. So I took this sort of left-right off the table, because for me it seemed a little bit old-fashioned. And I talked more about sort of higher or smaller degrees of pluralism, right? And think about if you want to sort of get concrete examples. China is probably here, right? With all this sort of social scoring and so on. Dubai is probably here. Government is trying to act as a big entrepreneurial, big enterprise, corporation, right? I don't know, maybe people who are, very involved in the open source software movement, they may be here, right? So lots of volunteers and so on. And here is all mainstream, right? So kind of a little bit of everything and so on. So you have different ways how people actually think about ICT and government. And in that sense, having one prediction or one forecast is also probably not sufficient. Okay, now let me show you what we did in Estonia. So I mentioned to you that I work for this think tank. It's a relatively new think tank. And we actually are involved in foresight. And we use a method called scenario planning that I already explained. We did a scenario planning exercise in Estonia about digital governance. In governance in general, including digital governance. I will just give you like a very brief snapshot here, because the whole paper we published last week is about 70, 80 pages, right? And here I am actually talking about the paper last week in the conference room of the Estonian Parliament, and here I'm discussing our scenarios with head of our state reform committee in the Parliament, member of Parliament. That's the minister for the state reform, and Mihkel Salvak from Tartu University, who's one of the contributors. I already showed some of the data slides from him, and we're discussing it. So the point here is that we kind of wanted to broaden the debate, also a little bit maybe be radical about some of the ideas, not to show only one alternative or 2 alternatives, but show 5 alternatives, 5 different scenarios. And we hope that it doesn't only broaden the debate and stimulate the debate, but we also hope that it will allow maybe decision makers to identify some of the key things they have to consider, right? And the way we did that was that, in foresight activities, it's not, obviously we'll go to the library and study literature and do some kind of data analysis and so on, but very important is to get lots of people involved, lots of experts and so on, different views and so on, and we did it a number of ways, the focus groups, also went to talk to the members of parliament a lot, went to the academic conference and so on, and had a sort of expert group here, people from political science, public administration, computer science, economics, some people from the ministries, some from the universities, taking part of it. And we came up with the scenarios to the 2030, and I can very briefly just give you some kind of idea what kind of scenarios we have about the future. So 5 minutes, then we'll be done, very briefly. And I'm only focusing here about the digitalization. The scenarios are a little bit broader, because we talk about governance in a broader sense, but it's primarily about digitalization. And first scenario is what we call an ad hoc governance, okay? And in this case, we're sort of talking about relatively centralized governance. Estonia is already quite centralized, we're a unitary country. But very important here is a quick decision making, and you have relatively tough budget constraints. It may be because the government wants to, have that constraints, but it may be because of some external factors and so on. And we basically say that, well, this is very similar to our current state. This is, this would be sort of scenario business as usual if we would continue doing things, because some of the initiatives and so on that I talked here about, for instance, e-residency, they have not emerged because there have been very kind of long analytical processes in Estonia. People have studied some issue for a long time and then come up with the idea, but they have been usually like done, kind of like on an ad hoc manner, very quickly. They have an idea, there's a PowerPoint presentation, let's implement it. And then the later will start analyzing risks and all other concerns. So I think it's quite characteristic to what we have currently. And what it means for the digitalization, digital government is that the main idea here is to save costs, but you would still have some priorities. You would have like things like e-residence and so on. But the results probably would be relatively uneven because you do something on an ad hoc manner while you don't pay enough attention to some other areas. Okay. Well, our next scenario, probably a favorite of many libertarians, is a night watchman state, right? And what we here discuss is basically that you still have relatively centralized government. It's a small country, but you don't value so much kind of like a quick decision making and trying to get involved in different areas on the basis of gut feel, but you have very principled stand. You say that, well, there are lots of things that government shouldn't do, right? So we shouldn't maybe develop global digital platforms, right? So we should be very principled in this sense. And for instance, we will cut the number of MPs, give them less money, all those things. So there is a definite sort of cutting in the public sector, expenditure. And for digitalization, it's a little bit like a dilemma. On one hand, this government is very pro-digitalization because it's a tool for cutting costs, it's cutting bureaucracy. But on the other hand, you're concerned about privacy and security. And so you have to kind of like balance the two, right? So, and there is a danger that if there's too much open and big data, maybe like privacy will be breached, right? Then we went to this another extreme and said that, well, there could be a scenario called entrepreneurial state. That's what I already kind of like mentioned. That's kind of like your Dubai, right? So where the government thinks that, well, we act as a big corporation, right? And we try to do lots of things. Here it means, for instance, that again, you value quick decision making, but the budget constraint is not as huge because you can borrow, right? We have lots of room for borrowing money, right? And then you can do wonderful things with that, like build nice highways or tunnels to Helsinki that we're sort of currently discussing. We're 80 kilometers from Helsinki. So we're talking about building a tunnel to Helsinki or bridges to the Estonian islands, or you can do those wonderful things, in strategic areas. And here, the big data digitalization is really crucial for strategic priorities. This government will do everything to use it for policy making, break down the silos and so on, and it will aggressively use Estonian-based sort of digital platforms globally, wants to have lots of e-residents and so on. So that's what we are kind of thinking or underlying here. All right, that's our fourth scenario. It's called a caretaker state. You may know it also as a nanny state, right? And in the case of nanny state, it's kind of similar in some ways to the previous scenario, but the difference is that here, sort of very quick decision making is not appreciated. It's very systemic, very analytical, and very detailed. Here, the governance is all about minimizing risks and worried about the well-being of citizens. What they eat, what they drink, everything, right? So, and here the government wants to regulate more or less everything. And what it means for digitalization is that key here is to deliver better services that are very even, very equal, high quality, and use data to come up with preventive policies. So if the data indicates, we can already go and interfere. So like you're in danger of becoming an alcoholic, right? And we will help you, right? But government also does not want to share data. So with the private sector, it's concerned about risks. And for instance, in this case, we saw that because this e-residency thing is very, very risky, it will be closed down, right? And network governance is our final scenario. And here we talked about much more decentralized governance than we had before. And in some ways it could be similar to running some kind of open source software project. Lots of diversity, delegation. Here we also emphasize sort of participatory aspects, not just services. Local governments get much more power, local communities get much more power. And for digitalization, it means lots of very diverse solutions. The sort of popular buzzword is a cooperation, but it's old one because you may know Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom. She already wrote about that in the 1970s. You know, she talked about LA policing, and she basically said that, well, if you have neighborhood watch, then providing this service is also much efficient, right? So basically citizens' attitudes, interactions with the government can improve the service. And sort of like the same, very sort of decentralized world, it will be a little bit messier than the sort of, you know, maybe some of the previous scenarios that we talked about. Okay, that's it. Thank you.